I live near a large, popular national park, and locals here, like myself, are well aware of strange sounds, strange creatures, and strange disappearances. I've dealt with these before on hikes and even just relaxing in the park. Here's one that still frightens me to this day. I was at my grandmother's house in the middle of nowhere. The only road is a gravel road that has been washed away, so without a good car. Anyway, my cousins lived in a trailer with their mother right below my grandmother's house. We played a variety of games, the majority of which involved me being chased because I was the youngest. My grandmother was admitted to the hospital with my aunt. So our older cousins, all named D, had to keep an eye on us. D was and continues to be the only older cousin we still hold in high regard. He would mess with us and play around, but he actually cared about us. We spent the entire day playing around, but we would usually play more at night, such as hide and seek and tag, and so on. We had been playing quite far away from the house, and it was getting dark. We decided to return home, grab flashlights, and play manhunt. Of course, I was the one being pursued this time. I dashed into the woods on the opposite side of the property, and hid behind a log. My cousins were getting close. So I ran, and when they saw me, we ended up running almost a mile away from the house to the very back of the property. And then we saw my cousin D, who looked at us and kind of ground, and we all ran away, thinking it was a game. We ran back onto the gravel road and saw him walk out of the tree line, but in a strange kind of glow-tingly way. We dashed into the house, and decided to barricade the door as a joke on him. We moved a few things in front of the door, but we also decided to move the large coffee table in front of it. We scooted the table across the floor loudly. D rubbed his eyes as he entered the living room from the master bedroom. We'd obviously woken him up with all the movement, and he was furious. When we told him about him chasing us, he got wide-eyed and told us to go to our bedroom and stay there. After about 20 minutes of sitting in the bedroom, he came in and told us not to worry. But it was just him scaring us, so we carried on with our night. He didn't tell me the truth until I was 13, about 3 years later. It was a walker of the skin. He told me that he had dealt with it when he was our age and that this is how it went. This occurred in the mid-1990s. D, and my cousin, like me, spent his childhood on my mama's property with his brother C and his cousin K. When this story took place, they would play games like manhunt and tag, just like we did. It was the middle of summer, and he was about 12 years old. C and he. And K. We were having fun in a demolished treehouse. They had just played a joke on K. And we're hiding in the treehouse from him. D. And C. I remained in the treehouse until K stopped looking for me. So you went back to our mama's house, leaving me alone. D stayed up in the treehouse reading comic books. The treehouse was about a half-mile away and on a hill, so you could still see the house from it, but it was still in the woods at the time. My papa was still alive, but he was in Georgia on a retreat, so he wasn't there, which allowed the 3 boys to do whatever they wanted. Papa would holler for them to come in when it got dark because there were and still are a lot of coyotes and bears around the property. Indeed, he decided to spend the day reading comic books, which he still enjoys, and eventually fell asleep. He awoke at dusk, hearing our mother yelling for him, and began to prepare to leave. He climbed back up after hearing a coyote yip as he descended the ladder. At this point, he became agitated while telling me this story, and he began to describe the coyote, which I recognized as the same one I and my cousins had seen growing up. It appeared to have mange, as there was a large tuft of fur missing on its right side and you could see the bare, pale skin, and human-like eyes. It snarled at him and the boards with its teeth. He was taken aback and simply sat back down in the tree house. The coyote sat at the bottom of the ladder, staring up at him. He said he sat there for about 20 minutes pondering what to do. He remembered he had a slingshot, and decided that the best course of action would be to try to scare it away with it. He said, he shot at it and it just ground more. My cousin was and still is a very good shot with a slingshot. I had a few bruises to prove it. He reared back and decided to aim at its eye because he didn't like the way it stared at him. He reared back and got it right in its left eye and it ran away yelling. Do you get a little emotional now as he tells me this? He told me he climbed down the ladder and made a mad dash toward the house. About halfway to the house, there is a large dip in the land with a lot of bushes and small trees. When he got there, he told me he heard coyote yips all around him and swore a whole pack had come upon him, but he just ran away. And on his way up the other side of the dip, he tripped and injured his leg. D became agitated, and had to come to a halt several times. At this point, he told me he got up and began limping towards the house, which gave me chills. He told me that when he turned around and looked behind him, he saw a human being with a face instead of a coyote. He stated that it began to walk towards him in an unusual manner, but luckily C and K. I started yelling for him, and it vanished as quickly as it appeared. D informed C and K. But they didn't believe him and told him it was just a nighttime trick, which they still believe in. As soon as he told me this, he kindly asked me not to ask him about it again, because he believes that coyote outside D is a very religious and reliable man. So when he says strange things are happening, I usually believe him. My cousins and I have seen the coyote he saw that night, as well as a stag since then. My cousin and I witnessed it. I've had 2 more run-ins. The most recent was last year. I'll also share those in due course. One of my cousins, who was with me that night as a Redditor, may soon share his thoughts on the events. I'm going to share some more stories about things that happened to me in the park rather than on family land soon. Some of my friends have also had creepy encounters, and if they're willing, I'd like to share theirs as well. I've grown to find it strange that strange things happen out here in these remote areas. I've had this story for over a decade and have considered posting it here. But all I did was talk myself out of it. I can't sleep, and it all came back to me, and I just don't care and want to share. So here we go. I moved in with 2 friends, to a newly renovated house. We were both professionals in our 20s when we discovered this great house at a great price and agreed it made sense to move in together for the year lease and save money during that time. To make it simple for any mental visual, it was ranch style and there was one hallway with the first bedroom immediately on the left, the second on the right near a bathroom, and my room at the very end of the hall that said, let's move on to the things we all agreed we wouldn't talk about because people would think we were crazy. We were going over the random spots around the house on the first day we moved in. When we checked it out, we didn't. Prior to signing the lease, I was looking at a built-in bookshelf and noticed that the trim around it was covering something white, red, and blue. I reached in, grabbed a plastic Virgin Mary with water in it, and summoned my friends. We looked at it, and on the bottom was a sticker that said Holy Water and the name of a local church. We 3 laughed at it and then threw it away and moved on. Within a few weeks, one of my friends mentioned his girlfriend, now wife, moving in with us, and we agreed that it was fine because, hey, it was more money saved for each of us, and we had plenty of space. When she first moved in, things became strange for each of us. The first strange thing that happened was that there were piles of swept dust in from each door, kitchen, and living room in every room except my bedroom and later confirmed my roommates' rooms. I thought it was strange, but none of my friends did it, and we all agreed it was strange. Let's say 2 weeks later, my roommate, one of his wives, and I were in our rooms when we heard banging coming from the living room and kitchen and ran out to see what it was. When we got halfway out and could see the kitchen, our jaws dropped as we discovered that every cabinet door, top and bottom, was open. Needless to say, we were all taken aback and perplexed. We shut the cabinets, brewed coffee, and sat in silence. This became a recurring occurrence that everyone encountered throughout the year. I was about 2 months into the lease when I began waking up in the morning or from naps gasping for air and feeling strangled, which terrified me as it continued until I moved out during that time with things happening. We were all getting along just fine. I was walking down the hall to my room one day after friend 1 and his wife had gone out to dinner when I heard a woman's laugh come from their room, which made the hair on my neck stand up. I leaned into friend 2's room to make sure they were gone, and he confirmed it, but I still knocked and opened their door to find the room empty. With these events, I began to wonder what was going on but couldn't make heads or tails of it moving forward. My computer desk was directly against the wall, and I sat with my back to the door. I started hearing footsteps down the hall behind me almost every day, to the point where I moved my desk and started closing my doors, so I wouldn't hear it or get creeped out. Unfortunately, even with the desk moved, I could hear footsteps if the door was open. 5 months in, I asked my roommates if my girlfriend could move in as well, and they said no. So when she came right before she moved in and everyone in the house, for lack of a better term, started losing things C.D.S. would vanish. Television remotes from bedrooms would go missing and would need to be replaced, as would a pair of shoes. At one point, this caused all of us to wonder if someone was stealing, which did not help the situation. There was a commotion in the kitchen and glass shattering one night, shortly after my girlfriend moved in, around 7 o'clock with everyone home. We all dashed outside to find the coffee pot had flown off the coffee maker and smashed on the ground. A good 10 feet away from the coffee maker. This was the point at which we all became very, very creeped out. 7 months later, a friend of his girlfriend moved in, and everything seemed to return to normal. With everything that had happened before, I decided I needed to find all of the misplaced items and began digging around the house. One day while working in the garage, I discovered a nearly hidden hatch leading to what turned out to be a small attic shortened height that wasn't finished but ran almost the entire length of the house. I grabbed a ladder and climbed up, having a difficult time opening the hatch but eventually getting it open and climbing in. I crawled through and found every item that had gone missing in the very back of the space. Because they didn't believe me, I backed out and had my friends go in one by one to see what I found. Both of us went in and came out as white as a sheet. I ended up going back up and getting everything that was up there, and when I got back down, I went out and bought a lock and hinge for it, just to give myself a false sense of security, knowing how difficult it was to open the hatch in the first place. Things like the cupboards opening and closing persisted and evolved into something. We all refused to discuss it. We met a neighbor our age while grabbing the mail one day and told him to come by for a beer when he had a chance because he had grown up literally next door and said he used to mow the lawn for the previous owner as a kid. He returned a few weeks later, and his first words upon entering were, "Wow, this place looks completely different." We asked him what the place used to look like over a few beers and got some strange responses. He began by mentioning that when he was a kid mowing the lawn, the owners were in their late 70s and extremely religious. He simply pointed to one wall and stated that it was literally a Florida ceiling with pictures of Jesus, Mary, and crosses. He went on to say that they were from the Caribbean, possibly Cuba, and that they would use goat's blood, or so they claimed. It was to draw symbols on the windows at certain times of the year. When I asked why, they simply replied, "To keep bad spirits out bingo. We'd found the source of our craziness, but we're still terrified, as I'm sure anyone would be. There were a lot of other things I wasn't feeling. But one friend in particular was, and he has 2 brand new CRT TVs to give an idea of the overall time frame. He had 2 freshly built PCs fail on him despite the fact that his pet wiring was brand new and he had apps that should have prevented any surges. These are just a few examples. I had a co-worker whose wife worked in real estate and local government, and after hearing the stories I told her husband, he learned about the house's history. I discovered that the crazy old owners bought the house right when it was built and died there after the house was sold. None of the previous owners stayed in the house for more than 2 years before selling it until the current owner bought it. Interesting, right, to use the phrase again. Shortly after receiving this information, I did something I would never have expected myself to do. I attempted to talk to them because I arrived home before the others. I told the 2 people who had died in the house to stop messing with us and that we weren't there to make a mess and wouldn't be there for long. I felt crazy, but sometimes you just have to do crazy things when you're crazy. This one-sided conversation had no effect. I started waking up in the morning to find things that had been typed on my computer while I was sleeping. I asked my girlfriend, who was a light sleeper, if I had been waking up at night, and she said no. The typing was gibberish, and it just added to my already rattled nerves. Around the same time, the same thing happened to one of my friends, who then started to get very creeped out himself. After about 10 minutes, I began to hear scratching going up the wall behind my headboard, and I became unnerved for the 1000th time when my door opened and in walked my girlfriend, who was silent except for the words "move over." The scratching immediately stopped, and I asked her why she had returned. She then said something I didn't understand but was told it was while she was on the couch, the 2 of us being the only ones home with the roommates gone for the weekend. She overheard 2 people conversing in the kitchen. I couldn't understand a word they were saying. It sounded like people whispering and gibberish. Fantastic. They're talking now, maybe a month later, when we're home alone or on the couch when I turn off the TV because she's asleep and I know I'll be there soon when I hear the voices myself. It would be an understatement to say that I was terrified. The voices were crystal clear and exactly as she described. If you've ever watched anything where there are ghosts and they talk in an odd backwards whisper and unintelligible gibberish. That's exactly what it sounded like. I looked exactly where they should have been and there was no one there, and they kept talking. This lasted at least 10 minutes. I say this because a few days later there was a heavy snowstorm and the guy with a dad garage band across the street was shoveling, and as I had just finished, I decided to ask him if he wanted to hand and he said yes. We started chatting, and I asked if he knew anything about her house. He then began to tell me things that explained more than enough for me to contact my girlfriend and then my roommates to inform them that we would be leaving early. He claimed that the old man died in my room at the back of the house. He had emphysema and COPD and would sit in an armchair in the room and smoke one day when he started coughing and couldn't stop. After a short time, he was practically choking to death in his chair, and his wife was out shopping at the time, only to return home to find him dead. A few years later, the elderly lady was in the room where I had previously heard laughing, which was apparently her knitting and sewing room, where she ended up sitting in a rocking chair when she needed to rest and fell asleep and did not wake up. I'm sure I've forgotten a lot, and this has probably been long and boring to most of you. But I've only told a few friends about it, and I wanted to write it down for some reason. Since I was a child, I've had a variety of experiences. I believe I am hypersensitive to these things. However, here are just a few of the stories that have terrified me, and I'm curious about yours. Number 1, my mother and I moved into a flat where an elderly lady had died before us. My mother cleaned the house before we moved in. No offense, but it was a typical elderly house, and all her belongings were left there, so we moved in and set up the rug tables, beds, personal paintings and so on. Everyone stayed. I slept in my smaller room one night. I had a terrible nightmare about the man in the painting in my room. Everything was hand-painted and personal, probably someone close to the lady. As I sat up straight in a cold sweat, the painting fell from the wall and the glass and frame broke, making a huge noise. I started crying like there was no tomorrow and refused to sleep or spend any time in that room from that day forward. Every other room in the house had an eerie, dark vibe to it. So, as I am now living in the living room, my mother and I were watching television when she decided to go to bed because she was tired. I say good night and she leaves, but I stay up and continue to watch television. This living room had a door that was glass but not clear. It looks like a smudged mosaic. I'm sure you understand what I mean. I just don't know what to call it. The hours tick by. And I see my mother messing with the hanger in front of the living room door through the door. I assumed she awoke and was probably looking for something. It got a little strange because she'd been standing there for 2 minutes and it hadn't hit me yet. She was dressed in one of those green tees that they use at work. And I was about to walk over to her and ask if she was okay, because I thought she was sick or something. She simply went back to bed in my room, where I had the nightmare. I didn't think much about it until the next morning, when we were drinking coffee in the kitchen. I mentioned the previous night, and she gave me a pale look. My mom said yesterday that after I fell asleep, I didn't wake up because I slept all night, and I didn't wear that green shirt. I wore a pink one and my blood turned to ice number 2. It was a high school class trip. We went to a small lake and had a small party the first night because I was having problems with one of my classmates, who had a huge crush on me that wasn't mutual. So I decided to get away from the crowd for a while. Yes, I drank some, but only in moderation because I've never been a big fan of alcohol and dislike the taste of it. You could walk around the entire lake, but you had to approach it from another guest residency because the path was divided into 3 sections to separate them. Let me explain that the apartment we rented only had 1/3 of this path because it was owned by the landlord. Finally, a really deep 2 to 3 meters pit on the other side of that fence. As I walk, I notice one of my classmates, Lily, at the end of the path, facing the pit. She is dressed in white and simply stands there. As I get closer, about 30 meters away, she turns around, looks at me with the horrifying expression that burned in my mind, and jumps into the pit facing me. I dashed there, terrified, but couldn't see anything. I started screaming uncontrollably and ran back to get help. When 2 of my classmates saw what was going on, they grabbed hold of me and began dragging me back towards the house, even though I told them I wanted to run back there so we could help. But they were holding me at this point. I was screaming and crying at the top of my lungs, wondering why they couldn't see that we needed help. I noticed her leap. It was quite a spectacle. They're telling me the next thing I know. What are you on about? Lily is back there drinking and dressed in red. I honestly didn't see any ghostly figures or anything. It appeared to be a complete person. Flesh and blood had pushed their way into the pit. My 7-year-old daughter discovered her uncle dead from a drug overdose on the living room sofa. It was determined that he committed suicide. However, there are many questions that will never be answered. He was 27 years old and in perfect health, with no warning signs. Most importantly, none of us believe he would do such a thing if there was even a remote chance his niece would discover him. He adored her since the day she was born. And I doubt he'd ever want to cause her such emotional pain. A number of circumstances point to the fact that he did not end his life, but that someone else would be glad to have him gone. We have a particular suspect in mind. But this isn't the place to talk about it, especially since there's no proof of it. Please do not hesitate to contact me. But, once again, this is not the forum for further discussion. On the night following his funeral, which was delayed for 10 days due to the length of the autopsy, my daughter awoke in the middle of the night and informed me that Uncle Dusty was in her room and wanted to speak with me. I followed her down the hall to an empty room that was only lit by her Tinkerbell nightlight. She wasn't scared, but rather perplexed that he was nowhere to be found and claimed to have emerged from her closet. The sound of the door opening was what jolted her awake. The closet door remained open. In fact, she stated that he kept pointing to his temple, then across the hall to the room, so she assumed he wanted her to go get me. The strangest thing was that she claimed he was talking the entire time, but she couldn't understand a word he said. His mouth moved as if he was speaking quickly, but she didn't hear anything. After such a traumatic experience, I dismissed it as a little girl's nightmare, especially since we had buried him that very day. It had to be on her mind. Heck. Even an adult would struggle, let alone a young girl. Let's fast forward. I was heading to the kitchen around 1 to 2 a.m. for a glass of water a few weeks ago. I finish my water and walk down the hall to my room. And, out of habit, I glanced in her room opposite mine and froze in my tracks. Uncle Dusty was standing by her bedside. I was wide awake and aware of what I was witnessing. I saw him in great detail, down to the baseball cap he always wore. While she was sound asleep, he stood with one hand on his heart and the other on her forehead. But here's what was strange, and I'd never heard of anyone experiencing something like this. He appeared to be made of shimmering glitter. His entire body shimmered as he emitted his own light. I was stunned, and he never moved, never looked at me, never acknowledged me in any way. After a few minutes, I stepped back and returned to my own bed. Some may think it's silly, but I felt like I was intruding on a private moment with his beloved niece. There were no other major events until my daughter, then 16, was diagnosed with a large tumor that had already taken over much of her liver 9 years later. Of course, it had to be removed right away. So she was recovering from a 6-hour emergency surgery at her local children's hospital. I went for a walk a few blocks away from the hospital property to smoke a cigarette because, as we all know, smoking near a hospital was strictly prohibited. It was late at night in a fairly large city. So I was a little nervous about going out alone, especially since I'm a small female and an easy target for anyone looking to cause trouble. I'm sitting on a bench, puffing on my cigarette, when I notice a tall, thin man in a baseball cap standing motionless across the street, just staring at me. I couldn't see his face because it was obscured by shadows. But, strangely, I didn't feel threatened. I finished my cigarette and started walking back, and he falls into step behind me, keeping far enough away that I can't see his features. As I approached the hospital's entrance, I looked back and saw that he was no longer there. He couldn't have vanished so quickly after entering my daughter's room. When she awoke, the first thing she said was that Uncle Dusty had come to see her in her dream. Then it occurred to me that maybe, just maybe, he was keeping an eye on me as I took my midnight stroll to ensure I was safe. Came to me alone in the middle of the city at night. The most recent visit has also come at a special time. My daughter is now expecting her first child. She called me this morning in tears, saying she was in the bathroom, doing her usual business of washing her face, brushing her teeth, and so on, and that as she straightened up from the sink, she saw behind her in the mirror her Uncle Dusty, who she said was smiling from ear to ear, but by the time she spun around, he was gone. This most recent experience occurred just this morning. So I decided to write about it because having a happy experience with a lost loved one can make any day better. My family and I relocated to an older home in 2017. It was in disrepair, but the landlord promised to repair it. We didn't have much money, but it was in our budget, so we bought it out of desperation. The house was on its own hill, surrounded by a large hill and clubhouse. Each room had only 1 or 2 wall lights and no ceiling lights. Strange things began to occur shortly after we moved in. My children discovered multiple angel figurines in a circle inside the clubhouse. It was strange, but I chalked it up to the previous tenants' kids doing strange things. The basement entrance to the house was strange. We had to walk around the outside of the house, along the side porch, to a small door that led to the basement. The basement was basically like someone had dug beneath the house and had no floors or lights, just a person-sized space where you could walk around about 100 feet in front, and that was it. When my teenage daughter and I went inside to take a look, there were remnants of funeral flowers and arrangements. Soon after moving in, the heaviness in the air was always heavy and dreadful. My once happy family became depressed, and my marriage began to suffer as a result of the silence. We couldn't be happy no matter what because we had 4 dogs inside, a German Shepherd, a Pit Bull, a Chihuahua, and a Terrier mix. All 4 dogs followed me around and formed a circle around my feet. If I went to the kitchen, they were there, if I went to the dining room, they were there, and if I went to the bathroom, the dogs would form a circle around me in the toilet. They remained by my side, refusing to move. Then the electrical issues began. We'd hear zaps and buzzing from the breaker box, and after several calls to the landlord, she'd send someone out to fix it. That, however, did not last long. We had to leave one weekend due to the severity of the problem. My husband was concerned that we would perish in an electrical fire around the holidays. Her eldest son dashed into the bedroom, terrified and crying, because he noticed a woman in a nightgown staring at him through the living room window. My husband and I searched the entire property but found no sign of a woman or any evidence of her presence. I began having nightmares a few months before my family relocated. I fantasized about setting fire to the house and dying on the bed while the flames burned me. They were keeping me awake at night. My husband began to have similar thoughts, and we both wanted to die in the house. My father-in-law began having hallucinations, screaming that the rooms were on fire. When there was no funeral in our front yard, he would talk to himself and pour bleach into a pot of soup beans that I was cooking. It had gotten so bad. I took all of the knives and hid them in my purse. Fearful of him, my husband and our 4 children slept in one bedroom with the door locked. Every day, we were convinced that he was going to kill us. Things were deteriorating. The desire to end my own life grew stronger, and we couldn't take it any longer. We found a new apartment to rent. And walking away from that house was like lifting weights. Every step made it easier to breathe, and I began to smile more. My cousin messaged me on Facebook about a month after we moved. It was a message from an old neighbor. The photograph was taken from the back bedroom of a burning house. No one started the fire and no one was living in my children's room, where the breaker box was. Since moving, my dogs no longer surround me, my marriage has improved, and my father-in-law no longer has hallucinations. I truly believe that house was evil, and that I wanted to burn it down. In college, my husband and I met. I won't name names for privacy reasons, but we visited one of our region's oldest colleges, which is over 200 years old and is said to be haunted. We started dating freshman year and moved in together almost immediately. Because I commuted, I frequently stayed in his dorm during our junior year. Jay, my husband's boyfriend at the time, landed a great living situation in which he had a bedroom to himself in a larger suite with only 2 other guys, suite mates. This was an ideal situation for us because it meant I could basically live with him during the school year because he didn't have a roommate. This living situation was obviously extremely beneficial to me, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Apart from sharing a twin XL bed with a 6'2", 250 pounds linebacker, it was pretty awesome. It didn't take long for me to realize how haunted the place was. I have a lot of stories about my experiences in the building and on campus in general, but it would take far too long to tell them all in this post. To provide some context, Jay was a resident assistant and had a lot of work to prepare the suites for all of the other students who would be moving in soon as a result of this. On the day we were moving Jay's belongings into the building, he was able to move in about a week before anyone else. I saw a tall, black shadowy figure several times. I saw this figure probably 4 to 5 times on move-in day and didn't think much of it until I remembered that the building was basically empty except for Jay, and the other experiences included hearing voices, hearing, scratching, banging, thumping at times when it couldn't be explained. A very creepy night alone on campus during a holiday break, when a major storm hit and all power went out, among other things. We had a lot of creepy experiences, but my least favorite part of living in this building was the feeling I got when I was alone. If I was ever alone in any part of the room, I would immediately sense a presence enter the space. It was intense, loud, and frightening. The best way to describe it is that it felt like someone was standing next to me, screaming in my face. But there was silence. We lived with this strange presence for the entire time we were in the building, and we were perfectly fine for months. But then something strange began to happen. Jay began to wake up in the middle of the night speaking in a different language. Speaking in tongues may sound ridiculous, but there is no other way to describe it. He sounded like he was speaking a foreign language, but it was one I couldn't recognize and had never heard before. Whatever he was saying, he always sounded intense and had an almost aggressive tone to his garbled words. For months, he woke me up by talking in his sleep like this. It bothered me, but I never mentioned it until one night. It terrified me so much that I had no choice but to flee. I awoke one night to find Jay on top of me, remembering that we shared an exile bed and he's a big guy. He was straddling me on my back, his palms flat on the bed on either side of my head. His eyes were wide open, and he was bent down, staring me down. I was immediately startled, but I played it off by saying something like, "Hi babe, how are you?" There was no response. Jay kept staring through me and didn't move. I kept doing this for a minute or two, thinking he was being silly or was groggy from sleep and couldn't form words. We stayed like that for what seemed like an eternity, but was actually only 3 to 4 minutes. He then got off of me, climbed out of bed, and stood motionless in the room. After that, he turned sharply to look at the desk and chair in the bedroom. He took the chair from the desk, turned it 180 degrees so that it faced him, walked around it 3 times in a circle, and then stood back to face it directly. He stood there staring at the seat of the chair for about a minute before getting back into bed with me and falling asleep immediately. I was staring with my mouth open. I know I tried to call to him and get his attention a few times to see what he was up to, but at some point, all I could do was stare and be bemused. This was the most bizarre thing that had ever happened to me. I told Jay about it and what he did the next morning, and he was furious because it had terrified him so much. He is not and has never been a sleepwalker or talker in his sleep. Shortly after this event, I decided to clean up the place with the help of a friend, and things got a lot quieter after that. Jay continued to talk in his sleep from time to time for the rest of that school year, and even from time to time the following school year. We've been married and living in our own place since we graduated almost 2 years ago, and I haven't heard or seen Jay sleep talk or sleepwalk a single time since we left living on campus. I knew that building was haunted, and I truly believe that whatever it was connected to Jay for some reason and attempted to communicate through him. I'm 30 now, but when I was in my teens and early 20s, I was obsessed with strange things. A few local shops sell unusual oddities and antiques such as art made from dead animals, skulls, pickled specimens, and the like. I began pickling my own specimens around the age of 20 after discovering that it wasn't all that difficult. I had some articulated skeletons, but I was more interested in supposedly cursed items. I bought cursed items on eBay, and even drove to different states to buy items from people they claimed or haunted. About 3 different D-book boxes, supposedly cursed from eBay, about numerous haunted dolls, and whatever else I could find. I also had some unusual taxidermy, such as 2-headed baby chickens and a snake with 2 heads, among other things. I had a few things I wasn't supposed to have as well, but to cut a long story short, nothing strange ever happened. Not a single thing. I never had a particularly creepy experience with any of this. I should preface this by saying that I've never believed in the paranormal or supernatural. I wouldn't call myself a skeptic because I believe that in order to use that term, you must first decide that something isn't real, and then operate from that position. I'm perfectly fine with admitting that I have no idea what this is. I'm at a loss for words. I won't say I don't believe in ghosts because I don't really understand what a ghost is. I've always been fascinated by aliens and was obsessed with them when I was younger, but I never truly believed in them. I just like the concept of them. Despite poring over documentary and late-night History Channel binges, I've never seen one or seen any real proof of one. So, on the subject of all things paranormal, you could say I'm a fox molder and I want to believe, but never really did after the events that followed. My mind, on the other hand, is much more open. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly what happened. So I was about 21 years old and working at a Walmart at the time, and we had these steps outside the tire shop that led up to another parking lot for a different building that we would smoke on. I went out to smoke one day and sat at the top of the stairs by myself. While I was smoking, I noticed a paper bag sitting underneath one of the bushes. I'm not sure why, but I looked inside, expecting to find some empty beer bottles or something, but instead found a porcelain lamb. To be honest, it didn't appear particularly creepy. It didn't have any bleeding eyes or anything, it just looked like something you'd find on your grandmother's shelf. When I picked it up, it had a red ribbon around its neck and looked brand new. There was a note underneath it in the bag. "Take me home," said the note. "I promise I'm a good little girl." No, seriously. I know you're about to stop reading because that sounds ridiculously corny, and it is, but that's exactly what it said. It was written in red ink and resembled female handwriting, which was really cool. It was scribbled on torn standard notebook paper. Again, I realize that note sounds stupid and cliché, but that is exactly what it said. So, being me, I took the thing inside Walmart and hid it under a register because I was going to take it home. I showed it to a friend who worked there and said, "Dude, look what I found outside, look at this note," and he said, "You should definitely not take that home," but of course I did. I lived for stuff like this anyway, and as soon as I set it down, I realized it was a music box because I jarred it enough, which I guess made it start playing, and I looked at the bottom and it had one of those metal twist pins you wind up and it plays a tune. So I changed it, and it was the least intimidating melody I'd ever heard. It wasn't at all creepy. I was getting really disappointed because if you wanted to play a prank on someone with a scary object, this thing was doing everything wrong. I don't know what the melody was, I'd never heard it before, but it was in no way ominous. Fast forward to the end of the workday, I get in my car, drive home, and show my then girlfriend she was into all the same weird stuff I was, so she was equally excited about this weird find. We cleared a space on our dresser for it, and from then on, we just referred to it as the lamb. Things started to go down immediately. Like the next day, me and my ex didn't have a great relationship, and I spent most of my time in the living room. She spent her time in the bedroom. I'd work until about 11 p.m., then come home and play video games on my computer until 3 a.m. Then, once she was asleep, I'd go into the bedroom and sleep in this manner. We didn't spend a lot of time together, and we both secretly preferred it that way. So I'm sitting in the living room the next day when I hear a rustling sound coming from the kitchen. I could see the entire kitchen from where I was working on my computer and assumed it was one of our two cats doing something, but both cats were on the floor staring at the kitchen, just as perplexed as I was. The sound seemed to be coming from the top of the refrigerator, and it sounded like something was rustling around the cereal boxes and bags of chips that were up there. I assumed it was a mouse because we had previously discovered a mouse in the house. Actually, it was the first specimen I'd ever pickled myself, and I went over to the kitchen to look for a mouse. I turned on the light and heard the grudge noise as I walked into the kitchen. I only saw the grudge once because it was one of the few movies that actually scared me. I'm not easily scared, and I don't like horror movies, but something about the Grudge's long frog croak sound scared me when I was younger, and the only similar thing that scared me recently was the screaming bear in Annihilation. I began walking toward the fridge while hearing the grudge noise. This is only significant because it is one of the few things I've ever been afraid of, and it was coming directly from the top of the fridge where the rustling sounded banned. My cats and I both froze to death. They, too, did not want to go near there. I didn't know what to do. I was literally on the verge of collapsing. So I tried to articulate this in my head and came to the conclusion that the fridge was broken and that a fan or something in it was grinding. I sat back down in my chair and put on my headphones, cramming that thought into my head. I did leave the light on. Normally, I sat in complete darkness in my head. I was really trying to convince myself that the noise was coming from the fridge, but it was difficult. But I was also in panic mode, thinking, what do movies and ghost shows say? Don't acknowledge it exists. So I became the father in every horror film and simply stated, fridge is broken, and returned to playing WoW while on the verge of jumping out of my skin, and using my headphones to drown out the noise. I actually stayed there for much longer than I usually did because I was too afraid to move or remove my headphones. I had this horrible thought in my head that if I took off my headphones, I'd hear the noise right next to my ear and turn around, and some old woman would eat my face or something. I'm not sure how long the noise lasted or when it stopped. So I sat there until the sun came up. I never went to sleep, and I used an Elvis playlist and chatting with my guild mates and WoW to distract myself as best I could, but I literally just sat there frozen in terror the entire night until the sun came up and my girlfriend woke up. She came in the living room around 8 a.m. and I was mad at her because I never went to bed, and she complained about playing games too much even though we both knew she didn't want me around any more than I wanted her around. But, aside from our relationship problems, she was bugging me about being on the computer all night, and I just said, I don't want to talk about it, and she kind of let it go. She softened a little, looked a little perplexed, but I think she could tell I was scared. Then she went on to frighten me even more. She showed me her arm and said, the cat scratched me up last night, and she did have a cat scratch down the length of her forearm. The problem was that she kept the bedroom door shut, and since both cats were in the living room with me and I hadn't moved from that chair, no one let the cat in the bathroom. They spent the entire night with me in the living room. In fact, when sunrise arrived, they were almost exactly in the same spot staring at the kitchen that they had been when I returned to playing WoW. I didn't say anything about it, just oh dang, and I felt like I was going to be sick because I hadn't slept. I called in that day, despite the fact that I really wanted to leave. So I did something unusual and took my girlfriend bowling for the day, followed by a movie and dinner. I was clearly behaving strangely because we never did anything together and I was clearly attempting to avoid the house. I actually asked her if she wanted to go night fishing, and she eventually asked what was going on. I didn't tell her because I didn't want to talk about it, and she turned down my generous offer to fish in the dark, so we went home. We began our nightly routine. I stayed in the living room while she went to her bedroom to watch television. This time, the grudge noise began within an hour of my sitting down. I willed my completely stiff and fearful body to get up and walk down the hall to my bedroom as soon as it began. I said I felt like watching TV, and left my computer and WoW open. My girlfriend mentioned that I was acting strangely again, and I declined to discuss it. The grudge noise was muffled in the bedroom. I took some Benadryl and went to bed when she did, which was hours before I normally went to bed. The next day, I went to work in the early evening. Around 9 p.m. she called me because I was the manager of the toys department and had a little more freedom with my phone because no one really supervised me. So I answered, and she was on the phone, terrified. I could hear knocking in the background and couldn't make out what she was saying as she screamed into the phone. Finally, I was able to form a sentence. She was saying that there was banging and that someone was trying to get in through the walls. I left work and drove home, staying on the phone with her the entire time, and she eventually left the house and began running down the street. As I was driving back, I picked her up in her pajamas, and she mentioned that someone was attempting to breach the walls. She heard banging on the bedroom's walls. I was pretty sure I knew what she was hearing by this point, but I still didn't want to say anything. I tried to calm her down by telling her it was squirrels. I mentioned seeing some squirrels enter a hole in the side of the wall and being concerned that we might have them in our walls. This was all made up, but it did help to calm her down. She had no idea squirrels could live in our walls, so I convinced her that this was the case and told her I'd call an exterminator in the morning to come out and inspect it. We returned to the house, much to my dismay, because my squirrel story had calmed her down, but that was short-lived because of the way our house was set up. We had a bathroom that was connected to our bedroom via a wall rather than a door. So you had to leave our bedroom, and the next room on the right was the bathroom. As a result, the bathroom wall and our bedroom wall were the same. Anyway, once we were inside, she went to the restroom and immediately began screaming again. When I entered the bathroom to investigate the commotion, it appeared that a tiger had been clawing at the bathroom wall, which connected to our wall. The wallpaper was torn off about 6 feet high, and there were large gashes in the drywall beneath it. Remember, this is all about 4 days after having this freaking lamb. We got in the car at this point, and I told her about the grudge noise. Her first thought was that we needed to get rid of that lamb. But something told me I couldn't. She wanted to give it to a thrift store or something. But I had this strange unease about doing it. I felt like we wouldn't be able to get rid of it that way. Someone had to know what it was and want to take it away from us. I'm not sure why I felt that way. I just did it. So, at this point, we did something unexpected. We just lived with it as if it happened every day. We had rules in place. The first rule was never to discuss it in the house. We never even brought it up. We pretended the lamb never existed. It was like that Family Guy episode where they had a giant octopus living in their house and no one wanted to talk about it when we had something to say about it. We'd always say, "Let's go for a drive," and we knew what it meant. The clawing at the bathroom wall was becoming more intense. Eventually, a huge hole appeared in the drywall. It was beginning to claw its way through the drywall that connected to our bedroom. That's when I started freaking out for about a year. We just ignored everything and pretended it didn't happen. Every night I sat with the grudge noise, things flying off the shelves, doors slamming straight up, paranormal activity stuff every day. One of our pickled specimen jars exploded, which was one of the worst. It was a bird we'd had for a while, and the mason jar exploded on the living room mantel, sending glass everywhere and taking hours to find. The bird itself also exploded, sending parts splattering around the living room, and I had a few friends who I would tell about it every day when I came into work, as if they'd asked for updates on what the land had been doing, and I'd tell them whatever freaky story we had from the previous day. It was literally a daily occurrence at this point, but it got to a point we couldn't ignore anymore. My girlfriend was waking up with bruises and scratches almost every day, to the point where it appeared she was self-harming. She had a lot of piercings and tattoos, so she wasn't too bothered by the pain, but she didn't like having to wash blood out of the sheets every day. When it got too much was when I was sitting in the bathroom browsing my phone and I heard a female voice say, "Hey, come here." So I finished my business and entered the bedroom, asking, "Did you call me?" And she responded, "I was hoping that was you. This is about 6 months in." At this point, it began talking in a literal sense. They sounded like little girls. I know that sounds cliché and stupid, but it would occasionally speak, and we could hear it. We didn't respond to it. Everything we'd read said we should never, ever respond. Every night, we'd hear it knock on our door and say things like, "Hey, can I come in please, please let me in." At this point, you're probably tuning out and dismissing it as some kind of overly long, poorly written creepypasta, but I assure you it's not. Her entire family was aware of it as well. My entire group of friends did. This was something that everyone was aware of. When friends came over, they'd ask about things the lamb had destroyed, like what was up with the bathroom wall, and we'd just shake our heads, and they got the message. Nobody ever came to our house anymore. Everyone said it scared them to be there and that they were scared just to walk in. Her parents had even stopped coming over. Her mother refused to drive down her street. Still, we ignored it as best we could. Until one night, as I was sitting on my computer, a voice from behind me said, "Hey, I thought it was my girlfriend." So I said, "Yeah, what's up?" without turning around. And there was no response from the voice. Then I realized it wasn't her voice, and I spun around to find nothing. I simply broke the cardinal rule by talking to it, grabbing my girlfriend, and telling her what I had done. She proceeded to call me an idiot for an hour while we drove around in the car and asked what we were going to do now. So I decided to look up local paranormal investigators. I contacted a local paranormal investigation agency, and sent them an email summarizing everything I already told you. They responded within a few hours and asked for a picture of the lamb. That was the first time I hadn't touched it since the day we put it down. I should also mention that it did not collect dust. I placed it in the center of the kitchen table, grabbed my camera, and photographed it. I sent the photos via email and received no response. Until now, that is. These people had been responding to me within hours, and now a day had passed. Everything had escalated tenfold in the previous 2 days. The house was never peaceful. The grudge noise could now be heard outside the house and would not stop. Half of the electronics were broken. The television barely worked. It would turn on and off. When the power was turned on and off, the taps would begin to run and then stop. The garbage disposal would activate, and the doors would slam and open incessantly. It had gotten completely out of hand, and we couldn't stay in the house any longer. I wasn't exactly wealthy. I'm making minimum wage at Walmart, but we have a hotel room. I brought a laptop with me and emailed the paranormal investigators once more. They responded this time, telling me that the lady who answers emails was also present, like medium, or whatever. That's when I sent her the photos. She had locked herself in her house for the past 2 days and refused to leave. They apologized and said whatever I had was out of their league. That is fantastic. Right, my house is possessed, and it's gone insane because I talked to it, and paranormal investigators won't even touch it. I considered calling a priest or something, but I'm not religious and wasn't sure if I'd have to have faith in the Lord Jesus or if I'd rather work. I contacted another paranormal investigation firm in the area, sent them the same photos, and basically begged them for assistance this time. They responded and were helpful, driving down from about 2 hours away to assist us. Nothing was going on when they arrived at our house. It was quiet, and everything appeared to be normal. All of the doors were shut. Nothing could be worse. They brought out all these gadgets that I'm not going to pretend to understand. I knew what they were for because some of them made beeps, some buzzed, and one made little lasers all over the house. They had microphone and recorder equipment. They staged the house and walked around waggling electronics in different places. I'm not sure what they were doing, but I appreciated that they seemed to be trying. They were not receiving anything, and nothing was happening. I even captured some of it on video. Then something unexpected happened. My camera stopped working out of nowhere, the battery just died, and all of their loud equipment began to make noise, and something was over 9,000. There were 3 of them, and they began conversing with it. If you're here, give me a sign, and then they asked me to knock on doors for like 2 hours. They eventually wrapped up in the woman with them said that she believed the thing was happening. Our lamb was not possessed by a spirit. She claimed it wasn't even a person, but something else. She claimed she was impersonating a young girl in order to deceive us. And the fact that we weren't being duped irritated it. They left, saying she'd call me the next day. She mentioned that she knew someone who might be interested. I couldn't imagine who would want this. But my girlfriend and I stayed in the hotel again, and the next day I received a call from the woman. She stated that she spoke with someone named John's office and that he was enthusiastic about one of the items. I had no idea who he was at the time. She told me he was the haunted collector, but that didn't mean anything to me. He was said to have a paranormal museum. They returned to the house, got the lamb, and mailed it to him. Later, I realized he had a TV show and was the nephew of Ed and Lorraine Warren, and that was pretty much the end of it. When this was Alpha Stewed agreed to take it. Everything came to a halt. We never had another strange incident after that. However, I never repaired the bathroom wall. We moved out when we divorced and left the house in the same condition for the people to whom we sold it. So, on a side note, I recently watched the Conjuring movies in the last 6 months and there's a shot of the Warrens' daughter sleeping in her bed on a nightstand that is an identical lamb to the one that I had when I saw it. I almost burst out laughing in horror, despite the fact that the one in the film has a blue bow around its neck and the one I had was almost certainly red. Before anyone asks, the one in the film also does not appear to be a music box. Yes, I still have the photograph that I sent to the original paranormal team. I'll post them here, but I don't want to touch the memory card that contains them. I'm originally from San Juan Capistrano, California. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the tour, which is currently taking place there. In any case, I went to Marco Forrester Middle School. I recall going to the auditorium because we were having a guest speaker talk about a book he was about to release about a kid who was abducted by aliens and how he was able to control the crafts and travel in the alien ship's computer system. I recall him telling us about his personal experience. He looked at us all, his eyes gleaming with delight. He went on to tell us about a time when he was a young boy and was playing by a large log with his younger brother. He'd been living near a forest. He told us about how they continued to play until the bully arrived. Please forgive me. I can't recall the exact details because it happened 12 years ago, but I recall him telling us about how the bully pushed him and he fell off the log, and when he turned to get himself up, he noticed something under the log that he had been playing on. He stated that he was so shocked and confused by what he was seeing that even the bully and his younger brother went to investigate and discovered a large, light brown, almost deceased humanoid figure. He described it as having long skinny arms and fingers and looking like a long darkish purple cloak with metallic engravings. His bully was terrified and began to cry. Our speaker then described how he took a piece of it and returned home with his younger brother. He explained that he began in a jar, knowing that what he discovered was otherworldly. He returned to the same location a few days later, but the figure had vanished. He then told us that after graduating from high school, he moved away and took the jar with him. He decided to send a piece of the clothing to be tested because he wasn't sure what he'd seen was genuine. He stated that he received a letter instructing him to submit everything he possessed, to which he replied, "That's it." Which he lied about. Without a doubt. He told us that it confirmed what he had seen as a child. He buried his jar beneath the floorboards, knowing that the people he'd sent a sample to were unlikely to believe him, and he didn't want them to take it away. The only evidence he had of what was possibly extraterrestrial. A few days later, he returned home from work to find his house trashed, not as if someone was attempting to rob him, but as if someone was looking for something. He immediately checked beneath his floorboards and discovered his jar with the object still inside. As he finished his story, he motioned for us to form a line as he reached into a black bag he had on stage with a smile. He took out a large jar. Of course, I could have told the kids that I was terrified of aliens, but I didn't want to be mocked or called names. I recall approaching him and peering into the jar to see the old purple material he described with metallic symbols. No, believe me when I say I got a chill from what appeared to be an extremely skinny hand sitting beneath the purple material. It appeared to be wrinkly wood. It appeared to be well preserved. We were so impressed that even the teachers came to take a look. Before he left, he told us again the name of his book and his own name. I even jotted down the name in my notebook and waited for it to come out, but it never did. I was in high school. I looked up his book on Google, but nothing came up. Nothing came up when I Googled his name. I found it odd because his book was supposed to be released a month after his visit to my middle school. He even prepared sequels and showed us the book covers. After I finished high school, I Googled it once more and found nothing from him. I have a bad feeling that someone at my school said something and reported him because there's nothing on him, and it bothers me to this day because he told us that we could look online to see where we could find his book, and I truly hope that he's okay. I'm nearly 20 years old and I'm still afraid of the dark. When I was a kid and I was following my father around to turn on the lights for me, he'd always say the same thing. You're afraid of what's in the dark, not of the dark itself. I believe it was meant to be reassuring, and although I don't remember much about my childhood, I recall my sister getting into trouble for even suggesting anything horror related. Every night, I'd be up having my parents check every crevice in my room, crying out to the living room about the shadowy figures standing over me. Of course, as you get older, you realize that those images were most likely the result of your mind playing tricks on you, attempting to make sense of the formless space around you. Well, Jobin showed up about a year ago. He didn't say what his name was, but I'm hoping that calling him Goofy will make him seem less frightening. I wouldn't say it worked, but it does make things easier. Jobin stands nearly 7 feet tall. His body is impossibly thin, and he appears to be made up entirely of shadows. His fingers look like long sewing needles. When he looks at me, He wraps one hand around the corner. I remember seeing him try to wrap those needle fingers around my eyes once. He even has the eyes of a cat in the dark, just a slight gleam to let you know he's there and watching you. Job in doesn't necessarily limit himself to when you're alone or when it's dark. He'll appear anywhere at any time, though I've never heard him speak. He is occasionally accompanied by voices that are both a scream and barely audible in your ears. For 3 months straight, I would quietly hear someone calling my name from the closet in my room or just around my shoulder, gradually becoming louder as I whipped my head around to find the source. I had my father check inside my closet because I was convinced that someone was living there, watching me and calling me professionals. Tell me these are just hallucinations that will go away with enough medication and treatment. The work is consistent. I try to ignore him now and then, but imaginary bugs crawl across the wall in the corner of my eye and force me to turn my head. He's usually around the corner across the room or standing flat against the wall if I'm lucky. The worst nights are the ones when I wake up startled in bed and turn to see him taking slow, staggering steps further into the room. He usually comes to a halt. When I see him, I never get too close. I forced down some sleeping pills and tried to rationalize the delusion several times. Last night, however, his elongated body stood over my bed, small, gleaming pupils locked on me before creeping away. I'm nervous about what he'll try tonight. An old friend recently contacted me. He contacted me to do a house clearing and blessing for him, which was a very unexpected call. This guy is a tough nut who is not easily frightened. He recounted the bizarre events that led to him contacting me. There are numerous unexplained electrical problems and strange noises. Animals acting terrified. The list goes on and on. As we talked, I began to form opinions about the situation and inquired about the home's history. The original homestead had burned down, so the existing house was relocated from another property. He'd recently dug down to turn the crawl space into a functional basement height, and discovered an old burnt brick foundation. I went to clear the house. I also acknowledged the spirits in the basement but informed them that they could not remain. I always ask that children and dogs not be present in the house when I work because they get in my way and distract me. As I sent the spirits out the door, both of his dogs just froze on the porch and their gaze followed whatever they saw upwards. I'm happy to report that it's been a few weeks and he hasn't had any problems since all activity has stopped. I believe a couple and one child perished in the fire. He's looking into it, and I'm curious to see what he discovers. It appears that disturbing things that have been dormant for a long time can often trigger activity. Hello there, friends. Thank you for your time. Subscribe and click the notification bell to be notified of all future narrations. I hope to see you again soon.